Hello and welcome to this video on the end of part 2 of Wide Sargasso Sea. We've only got a little bit of the novel left, so we're almost there. Now, as usual, as you're watching the video, make sure you're taking notes. And this video is quite short, so you might not need a whole page for this. In terms of plot developments then, at the end of part 2, we see Rochester writing to his father, telling him the marriage isn't working out. What we actually see is what Rochester wants to say to his dad and what he actually says to his dad. And what Rochester wants to say is that he feels like his father has betrayed him, has tricked him into a marriage with someone who's turned out to be mad. But what Rochester actually says is, "I'm terribly sorry, this isn't working." Then Rochester moves himself and Antoinette to accommodation near Spanish Town, and he plans to sell the Guambois estate. Now, Rochester is very specific about these plans. He wants to be near, but not in Spanish Town. And he wants new servants as well that he's going to pay. So we get the sense that he wants to be in control, but he also wants to be quite secretive about his relationship with Antoinette. Now, on the one hand, that might be because Rochester doesn't want anyone to know that Antoinette is becoming mad. Madness was very shameful at the time. On the other hand, as the reader, we kind of wonder whether this is because Rochester wants to continue mistreating his wife. We also see that Rochester's narrative is very disordered, and this is quite a difficult section of the novel to read. I find that I have to keep going back and forward and checking what I've read because the sequence doesn't really make very much sense. It reads a little bit like the kind of feverish narrative that we had at the start of part 2 when Rochester first arrives on the island. And his account of the present is interspersed, it's mingled with chaotic thoughts and memories. So we've got a quote from here, a quote from there, a memory of one scene, thoughts about England, all sorts of things all kind of mixed up together. And this is really interesting because even though Rochester is accusing Antoinette as being mad, his account could easily be the narrative of someone suffering from mental illness. You know, there are suggestions at this part of the novel that Rochester is actually the one who's gone mad himself. Now, Rochester prizes control above all other things, and we can see this really clearly in this section of the novel. It's right towards the end of part 2 if you want to find it in your books. So he says, "Then I wrote to the firm of lawyers I had dealt with in Spanish Town. I told them that I wished to rent a furnished house, not too near the town, commodious enough to allow for 2 separate suites of rooms. I also told them to engage a staff of servants whom I was prepared to pay very liberally. So long as they keep their mouths shut, I thought. Provided that they are discreet, I wrote. My wife and myself would be in Jamaica in about a week and expected to find everything ready. All the time I was writing this letter, a cock crows persistently outside. I took the first book I could lay hands on and threw it at him, but he stalked a few yards away and started again. Baptiste appeared, looking towards Antoinette's silent room. Have you got much more of this famous rum? Rochester asked. So what Rochester is doing here in this first section is using his power as a man, as someone who's upper class and as someone who's white. So whatever perspective you're looking at this novel from, whether it's Marxist, post-colonialist or feminist, this is an interesting passage. So he's writing to the firm of lawyers, educated people who hold power and sway over the community. And then Rochester starts throwing his money around. So he wants to rent a house, despite the fact that he's got one that he can live in for free. The house has got to be commodious enough to allow for 2 separate suites of rooms. So he wants to live in a separate section of the building compared to Antoinette. But commodious also suggests that this house is a commodity which is going to be quite large and therefore very expensive. He's going to engage a staff of servants, so we're going to have quite a lot of servants in this building, and he's going to pay them very liberally. So Rochester is using his money to gain control over a situation that he feels is becoming out of his control. And his sense of entitlement here is really clear, that he should get exactly what he asks for. Now, this is mirrored in the sentence structure that's used here. So you can see this repeated sense, I wrote, I wished, I told them, I thought, I wrote. So this repetitive sense that Rochester is commanding other people and he's telling other people what to do, and he's using the written word to do that. He's not writing down what he really thinks. So this middle section, so long as they keep their mouths shut, I thought. He's not writing what he really thinks, but he's writing commands that he knows will have an impact on other people and that they will respond to. But then these instructions are juxtaposed quite interestingly with this incident when Rochester throws a book at a cockerel that's crowing outside his window. Now, we've seen all the way through the novel that Antoinette and her mother are accused of being violent and are accused of irrationally attacking the people around him. But actually what we've talked about already is that when they do attack people, they generally have very good reason to do so. So when Antoinette attacks Amelie, actually Amelie has been flirting with her husband. Amelie then sleeps with Antoinette's husband, and is one of the reasons why the marriage starts to fall apart. So actually Antoinette does seem to be justified in that attack. But here, Rochester also commits an act of violence. He throws a book at the bird that's outside the window. And there's no real explanation of why this bird is particularly annoying him, other than it's being noisy. And it's just a really interesting hint that maybe Rochester is also engaging in violence as well. And if you remember earlier on in part 2 of the novel, when Rochester is speaking to Christophine about Antoinette, Christophine says that she sees the bruises on Antoinette, and she thinks that Rochester has been physically rough with Antoinette. So there are some hints seeded throughout part 2 of the novel that Rochester himself is quite a violent character. And that would link in quite nicely with Jane Eyre as well, because he does seem to have quite a temper in Jane Eyre. And then at the end of this little extract, Rochester asks Baptiste for more rum. And again, throughout the novel, Antoinette and Annette are accused of drinking far too much rum, of being alcoholics. What we've seen, though, is that Annette is given rum by the people who are supposed to be looking after her. She's given rum by the people who are sexually abusing her and who are keeping her locked up. And she's given rum with the promise that it'll make her forget everything, all of the bad things that have happened to her. So Annette's drinking of rum seems to be quite justified. Antoinette, in part 2, refuses rum a number of times, and she only drinks rum when it seems that absolutely her marriage is out of her control, and again she drinks it because she wants to forget. And then here Rochester is asking for rum, and earlier in part 2 he has consumed an awful lot of alcohol. So it's actually him, not necessarily the woman in the novel, who turns to alcohol as a way of kind of relaxing and so on. So this section here prompts us to ask questions about whether it's actually Rochester who's violent and drinks too much, and he doesn't have a good enough reason for this, whereas the women are justified in their violence and in their alcoholism as well. So it just brings up some interesting questions about Rochester's character, I think. And then here, another section from the end of part 2 of the novel leads us to ask questions about whether Rochester is actually mad and Antoinette is actually the one who's sane. So Rochester says, "As for her, I'd forgotten her for the moment, so I shall never understand why, suddenly, bewilderingly, I was certain that everything I had imagined was to be truth was false. False. Only the magic and the dream are true. All the rest's a lie. Let it go. Here is the secret. Here." And this is Rochester saying that actually maybe everything that he said is true is actually false. So how can we trust Rochester's narrative that what he said about his marriage and how he's been tricked, how he's described Antoinette's descent into madness, how do we know whether we can actually rely on any of that? And of course, the phrase that we'd use for this is that Rochester is an unreliable narrator. He's someone who is lying to us in order to cover up his guilt, his culpability, what's gone wrong in his marriage. And we have this sense here that Rochester is almost admitting that maybe he is falsifying in some way the relationship that he has, or the description of the relationship that he has with Antoinette. And then we get here an example perhaps of Antoinette's sanity. So Antoinette and Rochester are leaving their house in Grambois and they're going to Spanish Town, and there's a servant boy at Grambois who wants to go with them. And Antoinette has previously told the servant boy that yes, he can come with them, he needs to learn English, but yeah, he could probably come with them. Now, Antoinette tells Rochester this, and Rochester absolutely is furious with her. And he says, "He hasn't learned any English that I can understand," I said. And looking at her stiff white face, my fury grew. "What right have you to make promises in my name, or to speak for me at all?" And Antoinette replies, "No, I had no right, I'm sorry. I don't understand you, I know nothing about you, and I cannot speak for you." Now, in this interaction between them, it does seem that even though Rochester's narrating this, it's him who's losing his grip on his own sanity. So Antoinette's got a stiff white face. Now, Rochester's taking this as evidence that she's mad, that she's closing down, that she hates him, that she's retreating emotionally within herself. But actually, could it just be that she doesn't understand what's going on and she doesn't know how to cope with this situation? That actually it's a self-protective mechanism? And then we can see that it's Rochester who's filled with fury. It's not Antoinette. She's not becoming violently angry. It's Rochester who is. And then Antoinette's response to what Rochester says is very rational, very reasonable. It's very much like someone saying, talking to someone who's extremely upset and saying, "No, you're absolutely right." You know, trying to calm them down, trying to placate them, trying to get them to be quiet and relaxed and so on. And Antoinette here comes across as the character who is much more sane, is much more rational than Rochester is. So this then leads us to question the whole previous narrative about which one of these characters is actually mad, and whether Rochester is deliberately trying to send Antoinette mad. Okay, an independent learning task for you here just as we finish part 2 of the novel. I've got a quotation from a critic called Elizabeth Bayer, who is a feminist critic, and she says, "What happens to Antoinette is an inversion of the traditional fairy tale." And I've got some prompts here to help you to think through the significance of this critical quotation. So I want you to work through the questions, and in our next video we're going to be looking at part 3 of the novel.